All right, so let's jump into another deep dive today. We're looking at, I guess you could say, like a snapshot of what's happening globally, and we're using a really interesting set of world news headlines, all from March 21st, 2025.
Okay.
And I think the mission here really is to kind of like pull out the most significant threads and try to understand how they all connect, for all of us listening without sort of getting overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information out there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack here for sure. We've got everything from, the collapse of a ceasefire in Gaza, some really interesting shifts happening in U.S. education policy.
Oh, yeah.
And we're even going to talk about a newly recognized World Day for glaciers, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by that one. Okay, so let's maybe start with something a little heavier. The situation in Israel and Gaza, the ceasefire there seems to have fallen apart pretty dramatically.
It did, and I mean, very suddenly. So on March 18th, Hamas rejected a proposed extension of the ceasefire, and Israel, immediately resumed their heavy airstrikes.
Oh, wow.
And the reports of casualties, even just from that single day, are devastating. Some sources are indicating hundreds of deaths,
Oh, gosh.
and tragically, a lot of those are children. And then, of course, you've got the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which was already critical. That has been even further impacted by a renewed blockade of aid.
Really tough situation, and I imagine reactions are pretty strong and divided, as you'd expect,
Definitely, Israel is placing the blame directly on Hamas.
for rejecting the extension.
Right, for refusing the extension. Hamas is, of course, condemning Israel's renewed military actions. And then you look internationally, and there's a real split.
Yeah.
The U.S. is expressing, strong support for Israel's position, but other nations are voicing some pretty strong criticism.
Interesting. So it sounds like, are the underlying issues there still the same? Are we talking hostages, verming?
Yeah, it's really all the time. It's the ongoing issue of the hostages. There are allegations of Hamas, continuing to rearm. And I think also there are fundamentally different perspectives on how to achieve any kind of lasting peace.
Right, right. And it's interesting because we're seeing another major conflict ongoing, the war in Ukraine. And even with all this talk of potential peace, there was even that discussion of a limited ceasefire involving Presidents Putin and Trump.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting there is the different interpretations of what that limited ceasefire actually means. So while a halt to the attacks on energy infrastructure, that was reportedly discussed,
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine was also hoping to extend that to transportation networks, things like railways and ports,
Oh, I see. Okay.
which is, really crucial for them. And, unfortunately, while all that was happening, Ukraine did lose some more territory, and there was even a drone attack on a Russian airbase. Just highlights how intense the conflict remains.
Yeah, doesn't seem to be slowing right at all. And then, of course, we've got this other thing happening, kind of alongside that, the U.S. pursuing this minerals deal with Ukraine. So how does that factor into everything that's going on there?
It's a really significant layer, right? The U.S. has a very clear strategic interest in being able to access Ukraine's reserves of rare earth elements. These are, materials that are absolutely crucial for a lot of different technologies. So I think that raises a really important question for everyone listening. Like, how do these economic interests, how do they intersect with the ongoing conflict and the diplomatic efforts that are happening?
It's complicated, for sure. All right, well, let's maybe shift gears a little bit to something completely different. We saw Heathrow Airport shut down completely out of the blue. That must have been just massive disruptions for travelers.
Huge, yeah. So basically a fire at a nearby electrical substation caused the entire airport to shut down, potentially impacting hundreds of thousands of passengers. I mean, think about that. Over 1,000 flights affected. Really underscores how vulnerable even our most critical infrastructure can be.
Makes you think, right? Okay, back in the U.S., we saw President Trump sign an executive order that seems to be aimed at dismantling the Department of Education. I mean, that's a pretty big policy move, wouldn't you say?
It is, yeah. So their goal, as they've stated it, is to return more authority over education to individual states. Although it is important to note that they are intending to keep some of the core federal functions, like Pell Grants.
Okay, so like the financial aid.
Exactly, that would be preserved and redistributed. But, I mean, to fully dismantle the entire department, that would require congressional approval. And there's some really strong arguments on both sides of this, like where do you draw the line between federal oversight and local control, especially when you think about things like equity and civil rights in education.
Yeah, that's a big one for sure. We all have had some pretty concerning news out of Canada in terms of their relations with China, the execution of those Canadian citizens on drug charges.
Yeah, that's really heavy stuff. Understandably, the Canadian government has come out with very strong condemnation. And China's response has been to defend their legal system. And they've reiterated their stance that they don't recognize dual nationality in these types of cases.
Right, right.
So it's a really stock example of just how different the legal frameworks are, and it definitely highlights the strained relationship that exists between those two countries.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just taking a step back and looking at everything, there does seem to be this recurring theme of just rising global tensions, right? And we even saw that Australian intelligence review that went so far as to warn of potential major power conflict.
Yeah, and that really aligns with broader assessments we're seeing from a lot of different organizations. I mean, you've got the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, ASIO, you've got the World Economic Forum, the WEF, even major financial institutions like BlackRock are weighing in on this. And they're all pointing to a lot of the same factors, increasing geopolitical and economic fragmentation, the strategic competition between the U.S. and China, which we've talked about before.
Yep.
And I think something that's really concerning is this growing competition for vital resources. That's a big driver of instability.
It's a lot. And of course, we had a few other notable events happening around the world. The volcanic eruption in Indonesia that was affecting flights to Bali.
Yeah. Always a good reminder that nature can throw some curveballs our way, too.
Exactly. And then I think it was interesting, the news about a new search being approved for MH370.
Oh, yeah. I mean, hopefully that will bring some closure. It's been such a long-standing mystery, so I think any renewed effort there is a good thing. And how about Kirsty Coventry being elected as the new president of the International Olympic Committee, the IOC? I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
Huge, yeah. First woman and first African to hold that position. Pretty amazing.
Definitely. And then, of course, March 21st marked the very first annual World Day for Glaciers.
Right. I wanted to touch on that.
Which, I mean, come on, that's a really important thing to recognize. It really highlights just how rapidly glaciers are melting all over the globe. And the impact that's having on things like water supplies and sea levels, it's enormous. So establishing a day like this, it underscores just how urgent it is that we address climate change.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. So, I mean, wow, we covered a lot today. And I think the question that I'm left with is, we talked about all these different events, right? These ongoing conflicts, these big political shifts, the environmental warnings. If you had to pick one underlying trend that you think is going to shape the next decade the most, what would it be? And what are some of the key questions that we should all be asking ourselves right now to try to understand what kind of impact it's going to have on the world? That's our deep dive for today.
Thanks for joining us.